In the middle of a harsh western winter, a man who has lost everything stands on a frost-covered train platform, waiting for a woman he has never met. He only hopes to find peace at the end of his life, but the person who stepped off the train that day carries a secret that could change his entire life. A beautiful face, but full of resentment, a long scar hidden under the collar, a gaze that is both strong and fearful, and between them is a choice that neither of them can easily face: believe in each other, or continue to live in the darkness of the past. If you were that man, the one who lost his family, lost his faith, lost himself, would you dare to open your heart again? And if you were that woman, the one misunderstood by the whole world, would you have the courage to stand still instead of running away? A story of faith, the choice between fear and hope, and the healing journey every lonely heart has ever wished for. Join me in the story, and if you relate, please like, share, and subscribe to support stories that touch your heart. That morning, the Coppertrail Valley was covered in a silver mist as thin as the last breath of the night before. Heavy layers of snow lay on the black pines, drifting down on the cold wind from the northern mountains. The December air of the American West always carries with it a sense of desolation so lonely and vast that it dwarfs one's own. Elias Turner stood on the porch of his wooden house, his hands clasping the still warm iron mug. The smell of black coffee wafted into the chilly air, providing just enough warmth to keep him from feeling completely swallowed up by this sparsely populated land. At 48, Elias carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to suffering: straight back, broad shoulders, calm features, but his deep brown eyes always seemed to pierce something, as if he were looking into a memory he could not hide from. His lumber farm was nearly 8 miles from the town of Coppertrail, far enough to make people reluctant to visit, far enough to give solitude its freedom. There had been more people there, a woman's laughter and small footsteps running across the porch. But that had been 12 years ago, before the mountains to the north had decided to rain down their wrath. That morning, Elias looked out at the snow-covered trail as if he were still hoping to see his 2 loved ones returning from their long journey. But that hope had long since died. Only habit kept him looking, waiting, even though his heart was hopelessly silent. He took another sip of coffee, then set the cup down on the porch railing. Behind him, inside the cabin, was something that weighed more heavily than anything else: an unsent letter. The letter he had stayed up until nearly midnight, writing and rewriting several times the night before. Elias turned and entered the house. The main room was small but neat. He was as orderly as a former cavalryman. The fire crackled, but it did not warm the room. The dim winter morning light was so still that he could hear the wind coming through the cracks in the door. On the old wooden table, the letter lay there, closed, clean, as if it belonged to a part of life Elias never thought he would have the courage to face. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his fingers touching the thick envelope. The unruly feel of the paper made him laugh. He, a man who had been through battlefields, faced avalanches, and death, was feeling awkward over a letter. Elias told himself he was not the kind of man who needed someone to survive. He had lived 12 years alone. He had learned to sleep a few hours a night, rise early, boil coffee, tend the horses, mend the fences, eat a simple supper before sitting alone by the fire. He did not seek warmth. He merely existed. But this winter is different. He had felt it since last month, when the wind began to howl and the mists grew thicker. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night only to find the house too quiet. It wasn't a silence. It was something that was slowly draining him. Perhaps no matter how strong a person is, there is a limit to loneliness. Elias picked up the letter and read the recipient's name again, as if he needed a little more courage. Matrimonial Agency of Street Louis. Each letter reminded him that he was doing what many would consider a dare, signing up for a mail-order bride, a bride he had never met, whose face he had never seen, whose voice he had never heard. The thought made him feel uneasy, then empty. He hadn't sent the letter because he was lonely, or so he tried to convince himself. In truth, he wanted to pull himself out of the silence that had trapped him for 12 years. He wanted a change, even if it was only a small one. He wanted to test whether his heart could hear anyone other than the sound of the western wind. Elias rubbed the faint scar on his left wrist, a mark from the avalanche years ago. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the feeling of being buried under ice so cold that his thoughts froze. He was found hours later, but his wife and his daughter were not. After that day, he never believed he could love again. He looked at the letter again, Two conflicting emotions were racing through him. One wanted to tear it up, the other wanted to send it immediately before he changed his mind. He closed his eyes, a long breath escaping. "I have nothing to lose," Elias whispered. He donned his thick leather coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around his neck, tucked the letter into an inside pocket, and stepped outside. The early winter wind was strong, forcing Elias to duck his head at every gust. He locked the door and mounted his old brown horse, his faithful horse of more than 10 years. He touched its neck lightly. "Let's go, Rust," he said hoarsely. They set off across 8 miles of snow to Coppertrail. The road wasn't difficult, but it was full of quiet moments that gave him time to think too much. He wondered if he was dragging someone into a life of hardship, or if he was giving himself a chance. He wondered if a woman could bear the harshness of this place and bear him. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. But on the contrary, there was a feeling that was very light and vague, like a rare ray of sunshine in winter, a feeling that he did not dare to name for fear that it would disappear. As the spire of the Coppertrail church loomed in the distance, Elias tightened his grip on the reins. His mind was made up. The letter will be sent. No matter what happens next, he will not withdraw it. Because sometimes life begins with a small decision, and sometimes a man's silence is just his way of admitting that his heart still wants to hear someone's answer. He stopped his horse in front of the post office. The wind whipped the snow into coils, whipping it around his legs as he dismounted. Elias stood in the doorway for a few seconds, as if another moment's hesitation would make him turn back. But then he opened the door, walked in, and placed the letter on the counter. "I want to send this," he said. His voice was low, slow, and steady. The postman nodded and stamped the envelope. The click was light, but to Elias it felt like the sound of a beginning that he didn't know where it would take him, a beginning that he didn't know how it would change his life. It was only when he left the post office that he realized his hands were shaking slightly. And in that moment, Elias Turner knew he had just done the bravest thing he had done in 12 years. That late afternoon, Coppertrail Station was bathed in the pale yellow of winter sunlight, not warm enough but enough to make one feel a little hopeful. Elias Turner stood on the platform, his steps heavy as if he were stepping into a foreign land. The snow had been pushed aside but still streaked between the old wooden planks of the platform. Wet streaks clung to his high boots, seeping into the worn leather. He adjusted the collar of his leather jacket, exhaling a thin white cloud of smoke. The western mountains loomed over Coppertrail, creating the feeling that every movement in the town was dwarfed by the great shadow of nature. People walked by, mostly middle-aged men, widows with children, a few cowboys just back from the frontier. They passed Elias with wary glances, partly because he was rarely in town, partly because his silence made it difficult to know how to strike up a conversation. The wind blew from the north, carrying the smell of steel from the tracks and the coal smoke from the steam engine. A few people stood around, waiting for the train to arrive. Ruth Avery, the town's oldest grocer, looked at Elias from a distance and nodded. Elias responded with a slight frown, not brusque, but simply because he was not used to feeling like he was being watched. From afar, the train whistle echoed broken in the valley. A flock of crows suddenly flew up from the pine trees, flapping their long black wings in the cold air. Everyone on the platform turned their heads to look in the direction of the approaching train. So does Elias. He wasn't sure why his heart was beating faster. Maybe it was because the letter he'd sent 3 weeks ago had returned in the form of a real person. A strange woman. A decision he still didn't believe he was brave enough to make. The train wheels screeched against the rails, the sound seeming to prolong the tension in his heart. Steam rose up, obscuring the carriages behind him. As the train slowed down, the steam spread out like an artificial mist, obscuring everything. Then the third car door opened. The first to get off was a young man carrying a wooden suitcase. He was followed by a short old woman dragging a heavy cloth bag. An elderly couple followed. The wife was coughing from the cold as she got off. Elias looked around but did not see the person he was waiting for. He clasped his hands together in his pockets. Then, as if the steam had been swept aside by the wind at the right moment, a figure appeared at the doorway of the train car. A woman stood motionless for several seconds. She was tall, slim, but not thin. She wore a long, dark brown cloak, a little worn but clean. The shawl around her neck was a faded blue-violet, as if it had traveled many miles. The afternoon sun shone strangely on her face, bringing out her sharp but tired cheekbones and her pale blue eyes as deep as a wind-swept lake. She was nothing like the description the agency had sent Elias, and that was what made him forget to breathe. He stood up straight, his hand unconsciously on his belt where military habit still lingered. He didn't stare, but his eyes were drawn to the woman as if he had been waiting for her longer than he had thought. Some of the townspeople began to whisper, "Is that her? I think she's from Missouri. I heard she was involved in some church incident. The pastor died suddenly and she disappeared the next day." Elias heard every word, but he did not react. All his life he had learned to ignore unnecessary words. The woman stepped down slowly. Her hands gripped the handrail, her fingers slender but strong, unlike the hands of someone accustomed to a leisurely life. She stepped onto the platform, her eyes glancing around as if trying to find her bearings in a strange land. Then she saw Elias. The moment their eyes met, Elias felt something strange, not the awkwardness of a first meeting, nor the shyness of two strangers, but recognition, as if they both understood that they were standing on the brink of a choice big enough to change their lives. She walked closer, each step making a soft sound on the wooden planks mixed with the howling wind behind her. When she was only a few feet from Elias, she stopped her hand, still clutching the small wooden box she had carried with her since getting off the train. "Mr. Turner," her voice was low and small but carried just enough in the still air. Elias nodded. "Yes." She smiled slightly, a faint but polite smile, as if she had practiced that smile many times to face life. "I'm Clara Merrick. Thank you for coming to pick me up." Her name sounded strange, and Elias felt something run through him. Clara Merrick, a simple name, light as a breath, but carrying something indescribable. He opened his mouth to say something polite. How was the trip, but then hesitated. Casual words were meaningless in front of a woman who was hiding something behind those tired blue eyes. So he just said, "I have a cart. The road back to the farm is a bit rough, but we'll go slowly." Clara nodded slightly. "I'm used to long distances." Elias didn't know if the remark was meant in a literal sense or if it meant something deeper. But as she walked beside him, he noticed she limped slightly. Very slightly, just a little, but he noticed. He asked, "Did you hurt your leg?" Clara paused for a second, then replied calmly, "Just an old accident. Nothing to worry about." Even though she said so, Elias could tell he didn't completely believe her. Not because she was lying, but because he could sense the weariness in her voice. As they walked to the carriage, the wind from the mountains picked up. Another woman's scarf on the platform was blown away by the wind. A group of men standing nearby watched Clara leave, then looked back at Elias. There was something in their eyes that was hard to read, part scrutiny, part curiosity, and a little warning. Clara paused for a moment before getting into the carriage. Elias offered his hand to help her up, but she shook her head slightly and stepped onto the steps herself. Elias both admired her for her self-possession and felt a question arise in his heart. What did this woman go through to not have to rely on anyone? He climbed onto the seat and pulled the reins. The carriage rolled down the snow-covered path, leaving the station as the afternoon faded. Before turning the first corner, Elias glanced at Clara. She sat upright, clutching the wooden box as if it contained her lifeblood. And in that brief moment, Elias Turner realized that his life was about to change in ways he never expected. Not because of a letter, not because of a rash winter decision, but because of the woman sitting next to him now, the woman who had just stepped off the train, as if carrying with her a part of the darkness and light of a world he had never known. And he knew he would have to face all of that. The carriage pulled out of Coppertrail Station in the fading light. The road to Turner Farm was 8 miles long, winding through a land of pine and rock where the west wind blew fiercely, threatening to crush anyone who dared to live in this remote area. The soft snow rustled softly under the wheels, mingling with the breathing of Rust the horse as it patiently pulled the carriage up the first steep incline. Elias Turner held the reins with a gloved hand. His fingers, calloused by war and years of labor, occasionally tightened as if to steady his emotions rather than to hold the cart. In the seat beside her, Clara Merrick sat upright, her arms hugging a small wooden box to her chest, as if she let go for a moment, everything she held would vanish from her life. The space between them was as silent as a frozen lake. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like the silence of two people who were used to suffering, who had lived through winters far more cruel than this one. Elias glanced at her once very briefly. He saw the wind blow a few strands of dark brown hair away from her scarf. He saw her lips pressed tightly together, as if trying to hold something deep inside. He saw those blue eyes, too deep still, and somehow, like the still water at the bottom of an old well. He turned back to look at the white ice road. The road home is not easy, Elias said, his voice low and steady as if foretelling something, but what it was unclear. Clara nodded slightly. I am used to difficult roads. Only 4 words were spoken, but they caught Elias's attention more than ordinary words. I am accustomed to difficult roads. She spoke softly, but in that lightness there was a weight he could feel. The weight of someone who had traveled the roughest miles of life. The carriage traveled a long distance in silence. The wind picked up as they left the settlement. It was getting dark, but the last of the winter sun was still there, casting the western peaks in a faint orange glow, a final streak of color before night fell. Clara shifted slightly. Elias heard her sigh softly. It's cold here, she said, her voice calm. It's warmer than it's been in weeks, Elias replied. Montana isn't easy on newcomers. She looked out at the wind-swept pines. I think the harsh weather is sometimes kinder to the heart. Elias was silent, not because he did not understand, but because he understood too well. In the years since the avalanche, he had lived like the shadow of a tree struck by lightning, scorched and alone. The weather was bad but not malicious. People were different. Rust lifted his nose and slowed as they entered the windy slope. Elias adjusted the reins, leaning forward to shield Clara from the wind. It wasn't a friendly gesture, just a mature Western courtesy, but he noticed her hand was shaking slightly. Are you cold? I'm fine, Clara replied, but her voice couldn't hide the fatigue. Elias said nothing more. He simply pulled the leather blanket from the back of the chair and handed it to her. Cover yourself with this. We have a long way to go. Clara looked at him for a few seconds. A small, fleeting look of gratitude appeared in her eyes, but it was enough to make Elias feel a vague movement in his heart. She took the blanket, wrapped it around herself, and held the box tighter. The road leading to Turner Farm was not a main road. It was a narrow path through the pines, wide enough for a carriage but lined with steep slopes and jutting rocks. When the wind blew, the tall pines swayed, making a rustling sound like human whispers. To a stranger, the sound was unsettling. Elias is used to it. Clara is not. Those sounds, she said as a strong wind blew through the pine trees, making a long, long whistle. It sounded like someone was calling. It was just the wind breaking through the woods, Elias replied. The mountains here talk like that. Clara smiled slightly for the first time since leaving the ship. I think it will take some time for me to get used to the way the mountain speaks. Elias looked at her longer than he thought he dared. Mountains often speak more truly than men. That made Clara turn to look at him. Not for long, just a brief touch of her eyes. But in that moment, Elias saw something. Maybe sadness, maybe gratitude, maybe defense. They fell silent again, but this time it was not tense. About a mile further on, Clara suddenly asked, How long have you been alone? 12 years? Elias answered. She nodded, not asking any more. That answer seemed to be enough to get her some idea. And you? Elias asked softly. How long have you been alone? Clara put her hand on the wooden box. Longer than I care to remember. Elias did not ask further. A man like him understood very well what longer than one wishes to remember meant. There were times in life when even a single day was too long. The sun was low, leaving streaks of purple and orange in the thin mist. The carriage passed an open clearing where Elias often stopped to let Rust rest. But today he wanted to go straight home. The cold was setting in fast. Clara looked at the bare trees on either side of the road, then at the darkening sky. This place is beautiful in a lonely way. Elias nodded slightly. Coppertrail is always like that. Beautiful, but not gentle. You chose to live here because you want to be alone. Elias thought for a moment and then answered truthfully. Sometimes people choose places that don't ask them too many questions. His words made Clara lower her eyes. She replied with a short but meaningful, I understand. The wind picked up as the car moved onto higher ground. Clara shrank back a little, maybe from the cold, maybe from habit. Elias pulled up his collar and leaned forward to shield her from the wind again. The action was completely instinctive, without calculation or hesitation, and that was why it felt so real. The final path opens. Amid the deep woods, the Turner farmhouse appeared like a minimalist silhouette in a sea of snow. The log house was small but sturdy, its roof tilted slightly from autumn storms. Smoke rose from the chimney. He had filled it with wood before heading into town, a rare touch of warmth in the long winter. Clara stared at the house for a long time. No one knew what she was thinking, but Elias sensed something softening in her eyes, as if after many long months she saw a place where the wind could not knock things down. The carriage stopped. Elias stepped down and held out his hand. This time Clara hesitated only a second before placing her hand in his. Hers was warmer than he expected, but the slight tremor was still there. "Welcome to Coppertrail," he said, his voice deep but sincere. Clara stood at the bottom of the small porch steps, a wooden box in her hand. A gentle breeze lifted the flap of her cloak, revealing blue eyes that looked at Elias with something mixed with fear and hope. "Thank you, Elias Turner," she said softly. "I hope I haven't caused you too much trouble." Elias replied immediately, without a moment's hesitation. "In this place, everyone who comes brings something with them. What matters is what you choose to keep." Clara bowed her head, a small smile touching her lips, a smile that made Elias for just a moment feel the winter less heavy. The wind from the mountainside was blowing harder as Elias Turner opened the door and entered the cabin. He stepped aside, allowing Clara Merrick to pass. Clara stood in the doorway for a few seconds, as if considering something before entering. The room was dimly lit by the fire, enough to ward off the chill, but not enough to hide the emptiness that had clung to the wood for more than a decade. Clara looked around. No words, no judgment, just a quiet observation, like someone used to reading the story of a room the first time they saw it. She saw an old wooden table with scratches from time, two mismatched chairs, a pair of army boots placed by the door, a thick coat hanging loosely on a hook, a simple gun rack mounted against the wall, and in the corner of the room, a closed wooden chest covered with many years of dust. There was nothing superfluous, but nothing that felt like home either. The house was like a large body, strong but with gaps that no one could fill. Clara stepped lightly in, placing her small wooden box on the table before removing her shawl. The firelight illuminated the box, making the dark brass lock glow faintly. Elias saw her gaze linger on the box longer than usual, as if its contents were what made her fingers tremble slightly. "My house is simple," Elias said, his voice hoarse but not unpleasant. "I know," Clara replied, still looking around the room. "Simple, but true. I like it." Elias was slightly surprised. Most newcomers commented that the place was too empty, too cold. But Clara didn't say that. She didn't use the word lack or deserted, only real. A restrained and delicate choice of words. He took off his coat, hung it on a hook, and bent over the hearth, stirring the embers with a fire stick. The firelight flared up, illuminating his face, the tanned, angular, lonely face of a man who had lost more than he had. Clara stood a few feet away. The firelight illuminated her face, highlighting her fatigue but also brightening her pale blue eyes. She pulled the woolen scarf from around her neck and folded it neatly on a chair. Her dark, slightly curly hair fell naturally to her shoulders. "You can leave your things here," Elias pointed to a small room behind a woolen curtain. "I'll sleep out here for a while." Clara turned to him. "If that's what you think is right, I respect that." Her way of speaking was neither timid nor forceful. It carried the calmness of someone accustomed to living by principles, but also accustomed to endurance. Elias suddenly felt that the issue of assigned bedrooms was not the only problem she had had to accept in her life. He showed her the way, then left her to her own devices. When Clara entered the small room, Elias stood in the living room, watching the fire in the fireplace and feeling as if it reflected back his emptiness. Since the avalanche that took his family, Elias had never let anyone into that room. Never let anyone into the space that had once belonged to his ex-wife. But when Clara stepped through the curtain, he didn't feel like he was betraying anything. Just felt like it was the right thing to do. Clara arranged the bedding with the careful, patient hand of someone who had been doing housework all her life. She smoothed the corners of the comforter, adjusted the pillows, and rearranged a few small objects on the shelves to make them appear neater. She wasn't trying to take over the space, she was just making it breathe. After finishing packing, Clara stepped out of the room. The flickering firelight illuminated her eyes, making them as blue as a winter lake. She looked around the house again, then asked softly, "Do you have anything to fix before dinner?" Elias paused, not at the question but at the way she said it. Not the tone of someone trying to please, but the tone of someone used to taking responsibility or having to do it to avoid thinking too much. "I haven't prepared anything to eat," Elias said. "I think we'll keep it simple today." Clara nodded. "I have some flour and some salt. I can make some flatbread and some herb soup." She opened a worn canvas bag at the corner and took out a few simple ingredients. Elias watched, silently. A woman traveling hundreds of miles to a foreign land, carrying only a few things and yet still being prepared for herself and others. It made him feel both respect and unease, as if she had carried too many things that were not in that bag. Elias stood up. "I'll get more water." "Leave it there." He put on his coat and walked out to the well. The wind was so cold that the air cut into his ears. His shadow stretched across the snow in the last rays of the setting sun. As he drew water, he thought of the woman who had just come into his life. The woman he did not know if he could protect. When she returned to the house, the smell of herbs was already in the air. Clara was stirring a pot of water on the stove. She did not look at him, but she seemed to sense Elias's footsteps. "You have worked hard." "No," Elias set down the bucket. "Just water." Clara smiled very slightly. "It all starts with water. My hometown church says so." Elias replied, "I don't go to church anymore." "Not everyone needs to go to church to believe in good things," Clara said, her voice soft but touching something deep inside Elias. He didn't answer. He just stood there watching her cook. It had been a long time since anyone had been in the kitchen. There was a strange feeling about Clara standing over the pot, stirring with a wooden spoon, as if she had belonged there all along, even though she had only been there less than an hour. After a simple but warm dinner, Clara stood up to wash the dishes. Elias wanted to help, but she shook her head slightly. "Let me do it. I want my hands busy." Elias knew that feeling all too well. When we're not busy, our minds find ways to go back to places we don't want to go. He sat near the fireplace, listening to the sound of spoons clinking in the sink. It was a small sound, but there was something about it that was so peaceful in a way that made one want to keep it. Clara finished washing up and dried her hands on a small towel. She went to the bookshelf next to the stove and looked at the old picture frame on it. In the frame was a young woman with fair hair and a little girl of about 6 standing next to her. They were both smiling broadly. Their smiles lit up the room, even though the picture was faded. Clara touched the edge of the picture frame, lightly. "Your wife and daughter?" she asked in a low voice, as if afraid to touch other people's pain. Elias looked up. Not angry, not sad, just the familiar silence of someone who had learned to keep pain in a separate compartment. "Yes. They died in an avalanche." Clara bowed her head. "I'm sorry." Elias nodded slightly. "Me too." Clara stood still for a few seconds before leaving the frame. No further questions, no further elaboration. She kept her touch to the point, a tact that Elias rarely saw in people. When she entered her small room, Elias sat down by the fireplace. The fire reflected in his eyes, highlighting the fatigue of the long day, but also revealing something changing. A very small change, but enough to make him feel like he was no longer completely alone. Night fell on Coppertrail. The wind whistled through the woods. Snow blanketed the paths. And in the cabin where only the fire had burned for years, a woman's footsteps echoed softly like a second heartbeat. A heartbeat Elias never thought he would hear again. 2 days after Clara Merrick arrived at Turner Farm, the snow on the pines had thickened a new layer. The sky was still gray, but not the gloomy gray of a coming storm, but the quiet, spreading gray of a long winter lurking at every crack in the door. That morning, Elias Turner rose earlier than usual. He sat up on the bench by the fireplace, the place that had become his bed since Clara had moved in. The night was so cold that his breath floated in little clouds before his face. He got up and added a few more logs to the fire. The fire slowly spread, illuminating the woolen curtain that separated the living room from the small room where Clara slept. Elias looked at the curtain for a moment. He somehow felt the need to make sure that the woman was still here, still in this house, and had not disappeared like all the others he had ever loved. The feeling was strange, but he accepted it. Quietly, as he always accepted the winters. Clara emerged a few minutes later, the smell of wood smoke filling the room. She had an old woolen scarf around her neck, her blue eyes still a little blurry from waking, but she stood erect like someone accustomed to waking up in unfamiliar places. "Good morning," Clara said, her voice quiet but warm. "Hello," Elias replied. "I've reheated the coffee." Clara smiled slightly. The smell of coffee woke me before the fire. They sat drinking their coffee in silence. Clara occasionally looked out the window at the snow-covered pine branches. Elias looked down at the table and occasionally at her as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. Each time their eyes met, they both looked away, not shyly but with the caution of two people who had known loss. After breakfast, Elias decided to go into town to buy some more supplies. He asked softly, "Would you like to come along?" Clara stopped her hand that was folding. The kitchen towel suddenly paused. "Is the town crowded?" "Not many," Elias replied honestly. "But they do notice newcomers." Clara tightened her grip on her handkerchief, her eyes suddenly distant. "Some other day, Elias." "Today, I think I should stay." Elias didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded slightly, then pulled on his sweater and headed for the door. Clara watched him go, her hand pressed against the small wooden box on the table as if that was the only reassurance she had. It was 8 miles down the Coppertrail, but Elias hardly felt tired. The cool breeze helped clear his head. Every time he went to town, he tried to keep his mind focused on the task at hand. But today he had a strange feeling like he had to be on guard for something, though he didn't know what. When Elias stopped his horse in front of Avery's general store, he saw a few people gathered in the doorway. They didn't speak loudly, but they didn't try to keep their voices down. Every few steps he took, those eyes followed him. Ruth Avery stood behind the counter. She looked older than she had in years, but her eyes were still sharp, as if nothing had escaped her. "Elias," Ruth called, her voice hoarse but familiar. "You surprise me. It's snowing so hard these past few days, and you're still in town. I need some flour and some dried meat." Elias placed some coins on the counter. Ruth weighed the flour and wrapped it in brown paper, but when she handed him the bag, she held it tight for a few seconds. "The woman you picked up a few days ago?" Elias paused. "Is she okay?" "Fine," Elias replied firmly. "Why?" Ruth sighed, resting her hands on the counter. Ruth sighed, resting her hands on the counter. "Because this town is small, Elias. If the wind blows, you can hear it all over Coppertrail." He didn't like the direction of the conversation. "What do you mean?" Ruth looked around the shop. No one came near, but everyone was listening. "Someone from Missouri is chasing a woman who looks a lot like her." Elias tightened his grip on his bag. "They say she's involved in the death of a pastor." He was eerily calm. "Who said that?" "No one needs to tell. Rumors find their way," Ruth replied. "But I urge you to be careful, Elias. Not because she is dangerous, but because people are dangerous when they think they know the truth." Elias didn't say anything more. He just nodded, took his bag, and walked out of the store while many people looked on. About a half-mile from town, Sheriff Nolan Graves appeared on the roadside. Nolan was mounted, his posture steady like that of a man who had been patrolling the cold West for more than 30 years. He raised his hand. "Elias." Elias reined in his horse. "Sheriff." Nolan looked at him for a moment. "About the woman at your house?" "I heard." "Just a rumor," Elias replied curtly. "Rumors are enough to keep a man awake," Nolan said slowly. "I didn't come to question you. I came to remind you there were 3 strangers in the bar last night." "Nobody likes asking too many questions." Elias narrowed his eyes. "What do they want?" "They said they were looking for someone named Clara Merrick," Nolan said bluntly. "And from the looks on their faces, they didn't come to say hello." Elias gripped the reins so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You know I don't let anyone get hurt on town land," Nolan continued. "But Coppertrail isn't entirely within my reach. If they come after your farm, I'm afraid it won't be easy." "Thanks," Elias said softly. "I'll keep that in mind." "And Elias," Nolan spoke slowly, deeply, as if to make sure Elias understood. "If you protect that woman, make sure you know why you're doing it." Elias did not reply. Not because he did not know, but because he did not dare to name the reason. It was almost dark when Elias returned to the farmhouse. The fire was already red in the house. Clara was standing at the stove, stirring a simple pot of soup. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "You're back. I cooked something hot." Elias put the shopping bag down on the table and looked at her for a long time. Long enough for Clara to realize something was wrong. "What's the matter?" she asked. Elias did not speak at once. He took off his coat, hung it on a hook, and walked over to the fireplace, holding his hand out to the flames. Clara stood a few feet away, her hand resting on the wooden box. After a long silence, Elias said, "There are rumors about you in town." Clara's hand tightened on the box immediately. "What did they say?" "That someone is looking for you," Elias replied bluntly. 3 strangers are on Coppertrail." Clara's eyes darkened suddenly, not with anger but with fear being awakened from places she had tried to bury deep. Those rumors are often not true, she said softly. Elias looked her straight in the eye. I don't care if the rumors are true or false. I just want to know, are you safe here? Silence. A silence as heavy as snow covering a roof. Then Clara replied, very quietly, I'm not sure there's any place in the world that's really safe for me. The words cut through the air like a knife. No blame. No drama. Just a simple, heartbreaking truth. Elias looked at her for a few more seconds, then said, his voice low and steady, while they're looking for you, stay here, in this house, with me. Clara paused. She looked at him, then at the box in her hands as if it held the past begging to be opened. She wanted to say something, but stopped. The pot of soup simmered gently on the stove. The wind outside in the woods whistled in gusts. The firelight cast shadows on two figures. One strong and long alone, the other fragile and resilient, overcoming many challenges. And in that moment Clara realized she had entered not just a house, but the life of a man, trying to keep the calm before the storm. The next morning snow fell in thin sheets on the eaves, soft as the ashes of a fire that had lain dormant overnight. The sky was a gentle gray, not threatening like a storm, but like a blanket spread over the Coppertrail. The wind was still cold, but a little softer, the kind that slowly seeped into the skin, not painful, just a reminder that winter was long. Elias Turner rose before dawn. He had been accustomed to it for years, and Clara's steady breathing behind the woolen curtains made him want to keep quiet as long as possible. He walked slowly across the wooden floor so as not to make a sound, put on his old leather jacket, and went out to check the stables. The path from the porch to the stable was covered with fresh snow. The snow crunched softly under his boots. The landscape around him was covered in frost, the pine trees standing motionless like silent sentinels. Elias opened the stable door and touched the neck of Rust, the old brown horse who had been with him through many a life. It's a new day, old friend, he said softly, his voice warm. Rust sniffed, nuzzling Elias's shoulder as if understanding everything he wasn't saying. Elias cleaned the manger, checked the hooves, and swept the path. The routine didn't tire him, just the opposite. It felt like a part of life that kept him going after all his loss. He finished as the first light of morning filtered through the pine branches and touched the roof of the barn. When he returned to the house, he found Clara standing in front of the stove, her hands busy, the faint smell of herbs filling the room. She heard the door and turned, her hair tied back, but a few curls falling over her cheeks. You're up early, she said, her morning voice, a little hoarse but softer than usual. I'm used to it. Elias put his hat down on the table. Did you sleep well? Clara paused slightly, as if weighing the truth against politeness. Okay. It was a little hard at first. Then I got used to it. Elias understood that familiarity was not because the small room was warmer or the blankets were softer. It was because Clara's life had forced her to get used to unfamiliar places in a shorter time than that. He did not ask further. Clara invited him to sit down and poured some hot tea into a worn iron cup. The steam from the tea, mixed with the cold morning air, created a strange feeling, both warm and distant. I want to make some flatbread, Clara said as she put the pan on the stove. There's some dough left over from yesterday. I thought I'd make some breakfast before you go out to work. No need to be so fussy, Elias replied. I usually eat simple here. Clara smiled slightly. I'm used to simplicity. It's just, my hands need to be a little busy. Elias understood this better than she thought. When his hands were busy, his mind would not wander too far into the dark recesses of memory. He had been like that chopping wood when sadness came, mending fences when he missed his wife and children, polishing his saddle when guilt returned without warning. Both of them have their own quiet ways of keeping themselves from falling. After breakfast, Elias went out to chop wood while Clara sat sewing the frayed edges of the woolen curtain. The sound of wood splitting echoed rhythmically through the gray sky. Clara listened to it, occasionally glancing out the small window. The figure of Elias standing in the snowy yard, tall, strong, but with something gentle in the way he moved, made her feel a strange sense of security. Not absolute safety. She no longer believed in that, but a temporary security as light as a breath of peace. When Elias finished chopping a load of wood, he brought it into the house. Clara stood up to help, but Elias shook his head. Let me, he said. The wood is heavy. I've carried heavier things than wood, Clara replied lightly, but did not argue with him. Elias didn't ask what heavier than wood meant. He just set the bundle down next to the fireplace and noticed Clara's eyes fall to his hands, fingers with a few small calluses and a few thin scars. The hands of one who had to defend himself. Elias went back outside to repair the east fence, the part that had been slightly damaged by the wind last night. Clara stood on the porch watching him work. She didn't speak, didn't praise, didn't show anything but a silent, observant silence. A silence that made Elias feel like she was reading more than just what was in front of him. When he returned to the porch, Clara handed him a bottle of water. "Aren't you cold from making so much? I'm used to it." "I know," she replied, sitting down in a chair near the door. "But just because you're used to it doesn't mean you don't get tired." Elias looked at her for a few seconds. "You speak as if you were used to many things." Clara looked down at her hands on her knees. "Familiarity is the only way to survive." Elias was silent, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. For lunch that day they had some flatbread and the soup Clara had cooked that morning. The meal was simple, but there was something about it, a simplicity that made one want to talk more. But neither of them spoke, perhaps because they didn't trust each other enough. Perhaps because silence is also a language. After lunch, Clara went outside to hang some towels on the line. Snow covered the line and she had to brush it away with her hands. The cold wind made the towels flutter, revealing a few silver strands in her hair. Elias stood at a distance and watched for a while. Not out of curiosity, but because the sight gave him a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. Someone was actually living in this house. Clara finished fastening her scarf and turned back. "What are you looking at?" "I was just checking to see if the clothesline was sturdy," Elias replied, his voice a little awkward. Clara smiled, a smile as faint as mist. "Not sure. But it's good enough for me." A simple saying, but carries a layer of sadness that is hard to see. As the afternoon wore on, Elias and Clara did some work in the kitchen. Clara cooked, Elias chopped vegetables. Sometimes they looked at each other without speaking. As the afternoon wore on, Clara unconsciously placed her hand on the wooden box, as if checking to see if the past was still there. Elias noticed this. He didn't ask, but an unusual caution crept into his heart. Not doubt, but worry. Worry that the contents of the box were too heavy for someone who had carried so much pain as Clara. In the evening light, Elias lit more wood. Clara turned to look at him for a long time and then said very softly, "Do you ever feel like peace is just a thin layer over emptiness?" Elias set the stick down on the stove. He watched the flames eat into the wood. "Yes," he replied slowly. "More than I care to admit." Clara nodded. Her eyes softened, not because she had found the answer, but because she had found someone who understood the question. As darkness fell over Coppertrail, they sat near the fire, one on each side, the old wooden table between them. Clara sewed the hem of her cloak. Elias cleaned his hammer. They did different things, but their movements were similar. Both were light, both careful, both trying to hold on to the silence for each minute. After a while, Clara stopped sewing and said, "Elias, do you regret writing that letter?" Elias put down his hammer and looked at her in the golden firelight. "Regret?" He shook his head, his voice low and steady. "No, I regret letting so many years slip away in silence." Clara was silent. Her heart skipped a beat, not because it was a confession of love, but because it was a rare truth from a man who had lived through the years. She replied, her voice breathy, "Silence is sometimes a refuge, but sometimes it becomes a prison." Elias looked up at her. "Maybe we all need to escape our prisons, Clara." The firelight danced between the two, softly but enough to shine into the locked part of their souls. And for the first time since arriving at Coppertrail, Clara let her right hand relax from the wooden box. Not much, just a few seconds. But to her it felt like an opening, an open beat of hope. That afternoon the Coppertrail was a smoky gray. Not the smoke of fireplaces nor the coal fires of the surrounding farms, but the kind of gray that made one feel that something ominous was approaching. The air was heavier than the previous days, and the wind carried the scent of a long night ahead. Elias Turner was standing outside the stable, closing the wooden door, when he heard the sound of hooves from the end of the trail. The sound was heavy and steady, not the leisurely pace of the Coppertrail people, but the hurried pace of a long-distance traveler with a clear purpose. He put down his hammer, stood up straight, and looked toward the small slope leading into the farm. 3 figures on horseback appeared from behind the trees. Elias said nothing, but his shoulders tightened instinctively, the instinct of someone who had lived long enough to know that when trouble knocked, it never knocked softly. Clara stood on the porch gathering some towels and saw the scene. She stopped immediately. The peace on her face vanished in a breath, replaced by the deep worry that Elias had only glimpsed when she first arrived. The three men stopped their horses before the gate. The leader was a man of about 40, with a gaunt face and eyes as deep as coal pits. The two behind him were younger, more street-like than frontier men from the big eastern towns, not accustomed to bowing to nature as Westerners did. The leader spoke, his voice soft but sharp as a thin knife. "Mr. Turner." Elias did not reply. He simply kept his eyes fixed on the man, neither hostile nor welcoming. Just the mature wariness of someone who had seen trouble come to his door many times. Clara stood in the doorway, half hidden in shadow. She clutched her handkerchief so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I hear you have a woman named Clara Merrick," the man continued. "We have come on behalf of her family." Elias saw Clara shiver slightly behind her. He replied slowly, each word weighing heavily. "If she needs to see someone she knows, I'll ask her. Otherwise, you have no reason to be here." The other man smiled slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You misunderstand. We didn't ask permission to come here. We're supposed to take her home." The man took a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out to Elias. It was old and crumpled, but the seal was still legible. A warrant. From Missouri. "Clara Merrick is under investigation for the death of the Reverend Jonathan Hale." Clara took another half-step back from the door as if memories were rushing over her. Elias didn't look at the paper. "She told me enough for me to understand," he said coldly. "And until Montana law requires it, she's here. Under my protection." One of the young men behind him chuckled. "You think this remote place can hide the truth?" Elias turned to look at the man, his gaze so steely and calm that it made the young man stop laughing. "I don't hide the truth," Elias said, "but I hide the person who needs to be hidden." Clara looked at him through the crack in the door. The scarf she was holding had fallen from her hand without her noticing. Her eyes contained surprise and fear mixed together into a depth of emotion she had never let anyone see. The leader cleared his throat. "You don't understand the situation, Turner. Not all dead people deserve to die. We're not leaving Coppertrail until we find her." Elias did not waver. "I have finished speaking." The three men glanced at each other. No one drew a gun, but the look was enough for Elias to understand this meeting was only a beginning. The leader said one last thing before turning his horse. "Sooner or later, Mr. Turner, the truth will force you to hand her over to us." They turned away the horses, blowing white mist into the cold air. As the sound of hooves faded into the woods, Elias stepped back onto the porch. Clara stood there. She did not hide the trembling in her eyes, but she did not shy away from him either. "Elias." Her voice came out like wind caught in her throat. He moved closer, standing far enough away so as not to make her feel cornered. "Who are those people really, Clara?" She took a breath, looking out at the pines. "I don't know them. But I know the people behind them." "The pastor's family?" Elias asked. Clara nodded. "They don't believe I'm innocent." "They never did." Elias asked softly, not urgently, not probingly. "Did you kill him?" The question made Clara close her eyes. A moment as long as winter could drag down on her shoulders. Then she opened her eyes and looked straight at Elias. "I didn't kill him out of revenge. I just didn't want to die." Elias sighed, not in disappointment but in understanding. "Nolan said the dead man's family is powerful," he said. "If they hired someone to come here, they wouldn't stop." Clara turned away, her voice like thin mist. "I don't want to drag you into this." "Elias, I can leave." "No," Elias said immediately, as if the answer had been in him before Clara had even thought of it. Her eyes widened. "You don't understand. If I stay here, you'll be in danger." "Danger is coming with or without you," Elias replied. "I will not abandon a man who is trying to stand firm." Clara looked at him so long that the firelight reflected in her blue eyes. It was not the look of someone looking for pity. It was the look of someone who had just been given back something she thought she had lost: trust. "Elias." Her voice was breaking. "Why would you do this to someone like me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the house where he had lived alone for almost 10 years. At the old boots by the door. At the bench where he had slept for so many long, lonely nights. Then at the woman standing before him, a woman with a secret, a pain, but also with something that made the house less cold. Finally, Elias said, because there are people. When you look into their eyes, you know they've been running long enough. Clara reached out and hugged the wooden box, as if that sentence had just opened a door she had locked for years. The wind outside the forest blew harder, whipping against the wooden walls as if foretelling an approaching storm. And in the small house in the valley, two people stood facing each other, one who had run all his life, the other who had waited all his life, now facing the approaching darkness. No one knew what was coming, but for the first time Clara wasn't just scared. She was hopeful. That night the sky darkened sooner than usual. The clouds were heavy, as if weighed down by the mountains to the west. The wind howled, whipping the wooden roof as if it were trying to rip it off the ground. The Turner house felt small, warm, but as taut as an overstretched string. Clara Merrick sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the hot iron cup. She did not drink, but held it as if to keep a foothold in reality. Elias Turner sat close to the fire, listening to the wind, the pines, the snow hitting the window, and Clara's uneven breathing. He knew she was afraid, not of the wind, but of people. Missourians weren't the type to give up on a warning. Elias looked at Clara. "Do you want to leave early?" Clara shook her head. Her curly hair touched her collar, swaying with her breathing. "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that moment." Elias didn't ask what moment. He knew. He waited. He didn't push. He didn't demand. He just sat there like a tree standing strong in the storm. Clara looked into the fire for a long moment, then put the cup down on the table and took a deep breath. "Elias, I have to tell you something I've been avoiding." He turned around, his eyes calm. "I'm listening." Clara placed her hand on the wooden box, the object she had not left since arriving. "When I left Missouri, I took the only thing I thought could protect me." She touched the lid lightly. "In here isn't gold, not money, just a letter. A letter from Reverend Hale to me." Elias frowned slightly. "Letter?" Clara nodded. "Yes, the letters prove that he is not what everyone thinks." The wind outside beat hard against the windows. The fireplace crackled. Clara continued, her voice low but no longer trembling. "He was a fine man on the outside. He had power in the church. He had a voice in the town. He was respected by everyone." She paused. "But at home, he was not like that." Elias did not interject. "He used God's word to control me, made me submit, forced me to keep quiet about what he did." Clara pursed her lips. "Then one day, when I wanted to leave, he became violent. I protected myself with something I found nearby, the iron candlestick from the altar." Elias breathed slowly, deeply, as if to suck all that pain from the air so it wouldn't fall on Clara again. "His family is powerful," Clara continued. "They believe I deceived the priest, that I seduced him, that his death was my fault." She trembled slightly. "They want me hanged, Elias, even though he attacked me first." Elias clenched his hands into fists. He hated violence, but there was one kind of man who made it impossible for him to keep his composure. Clara looked down at the wooden box with remorse. "When I found the letters, I knew that if someone read them, the truth would come out. But at the same time, they would make his family hate me even more. I left Missouri because they said, if I don't turn myself in, they'll come looking for me." Elias sat still, his eyes deep and calm but without any judgment. Clara looked up, looking straight at him. This look was the courage of someone tired of running. "Elias, if you want me to leave, I understand. I don't want anyone to suffer because of me." He stood up, walked to the table, placed both hands on the rough wood surface, and bent down to her eye level. "Clara, I have seen real fear, and I have seen people do harm for the sake of power. I know the look in the eyes of innocent people when they are cornered." He paused, his voice slower and deeper. "That look is right in front of me, and I won't let anyone touch you." Clara paused, her lip trembling slightly, not from fear, but because someone believed her for the first time in so many years. A rumble of thunder shook the house slightly. The storm had officially descended on Coppertrail. Clara hugged the wooden box tightly. "Elias, I fear that one day you will regret trusting me." He shook his head. "If I regretted it, I wouldn't have opened the door for you in the first place." The words made Clara close her eyes, like someone who had just passed a long slope and could finally stand still and breathe. The storm intensified. Snow began to beat against the windows, gusts that seemed to shatter the glass. The wind howled through the cracks like a lament. The roof panels creaked. Elias added more wood to the stove, then checked the latch and the bars on the window. Clara stood behind him, watching his shadow in the firelight. It was long on the floor, strong and steady as an old pine tree in a storm. "Have you ever been afraid someone would come to you like they came to me?" Clara asked, her voice deep but soft. Elias paused. "Yes," he replied. "The first years after my wife and children died." He pulled the curtain down and readjusted it. "I was at fault for that avalanche. Though not entirely. But I survived. They didn't. I'm haunted by the possibility that someone will come after me." Clara fell silent, not because the story was so painful, but because she knew the feeling. The feeling of the past, standing by the door, waiting for a chance to come in. Elias sat down near the fireplace. Clara put the wooden box on the table and sat across from him. The firelight illuminated her face, highlighting her fatigue and strength at the same time. "We are more alike than I thought," Clara said softly. Elias shrugged. "Perhaps two people haunted by the past understand each other." A strong gust of wind made the main door shake with a loud bang. Clara jumped reflexively, stretching. Elias stood up immediately, placing his hand on the butt of the gun hanging near the door. "It wasn't them," he said. "It was the storm." Clara nodded but could not relax. Her whole body felt like a taut string that had been stretched for hours. Elias turned and pulled the chair closer. "Sit near the fire. The storm is fierce. You should not be alone tonight." Clara hesitated for a few seconds, then walked over. She wrapped herself in a towel and sat down beside him. The warmth from the stove spread over them, mixing with the whistling wind and the crackling fire to create a strange rhythm, a rhythm that made one feel lonely but not completely alone. Clara said in a low voice, "I have been through worse nights than storms. But tonight, with you here, I feel less afraid." Elias looked at her for a long time, then replied, "I don't know what I can do, but I know I won't leave her alone." Clara bowed her head, her eyes glistening, not from crying but from trust. The storm continued to rage outside, but in the small house something new happened, something fragile but true. Two people for the first time shared not just a roof, but also their fear. And in that sharing, a small step of healing begins. The storm lasted until nearly noon the next day. That morning, as the first light crept timidly over the pines, the Coppertrail Valley seemed strangely quiet. The ground was so white it was cold to look at. The pine branches were whipped by the wind and the snow lay in great sheets. The sky was gray, but a soft gray like a storm breathing its last. Elias Turner opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit him like an unpleasant but familiar greeting. He closed the door quickly to keep Clara warm, then stood for a few seconds on the porch looking down the snow-covered path. Before him the world was white. No footprints, no voices. Only the gentle wind touching the pine branches. The sense of security was fleeting, then gone. The men from Missouri were still somewhere. He heard a noise inside. Clara stepped out from behind the woolen curtain, her dark hair a little tousled but her eyes brighter than last night. She was wearing a thick woolen coat, her hands wrapped in her sleeves as if she were still used to protecting herself. "It stopped," Clara said, her voice warm from the fire. "Yes," Elias replied, "but the snow was too deep. I had to clear the way." Clara looked at him as if she wanted to ask something but hesitated. Finally she said, "Do you want me to help?" Elias shook his head. "The snow is deep. Stay inside. I'll take care of it." Clara nodded slightly, though her eyes showed she wanted to do more. Elias guessed that Clara had lived alone all her life and she wasn't used to sitting still while others worked. But this morning perhaps she understood it was time to let him go alone. He grabbed a metal shovel and began shoveling snow from the porch into the yard. Each shoveling stroke was so heavy it strained his shoulder muscles. His breath steamed in the cold air. Each shoveling stroke was a struggle to keep his mind focused, to keep from thinking too much about the three strange men who kept lurking near Coppertrail. Inside, Clara pulled aside the woolen curtain and looked out. She stood there for so long that a slight mist formed on the glass. She watched Elias dig his feet into the snow, the firm movement of his shoulders, the way he stood against the vast white background like a statue, alone but also strong. That man is helping her carry something that she dare not carry alone anymore. Clara turned away from the door, stoked the stove, and prepared some flatbread and herb soup for Elias when he returned. But as she worked, her mind drifted elsewhere, to Missouri, to unforgiving people, to knocks at the door in the middle of the night, to the whispers of parishioners when they didn't think she could hear. And then, Elias's silence. The silence that calmed her. When Elias returned to the house nearly half an hour later, his coat was covered with snow. He shook it out on the porch, stepped inside, and closed the door. The warmth of the kitchen touched his face, carrying with it the scent of herbs and fresh-baked bread, a faint scent but enough to make him feel that the house was no longer a place where only one person had left. Clara handed him a towel. "Wipe it off. It's cold." Elias took it, wiping his face and hair. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "I made some soup. Eat it and rest a bit." Elias did not object. He sat down at the table and watched Clara leisurely ladle soup into a bowl. She placed the bowl in front of him and poured hot tea. These simple but sure gestures made Elias realize that he had lived alone for too long. "The eastern woods are quiet," Elias said, putting down his spoon. "No horse tracks. No men." Clara nodded slightly, but worry did not leave her eyes. "Elias, do you think they will come back?" Elias looked straight at her. "Yes." Clara swallowed slowly. "And when they come, I will stand between them and you." Elias's voice was not high, not fierce, but so firm that Clara felt her whole body soften. She placed her hand on the wooden box. "I know these letters could embarrass them, could make them want me gone forever. Elias, if you keep me here, they will see you as someone who opposes them." Elias replied immediately without thinking, "I am not afraid of them." Clara looked at him, her eyes wet but strong. "I'm afraid you'll get hurt." Elias tilted his head slightly. "I don't go down easily, Clara. It's not just the body," she said softly. "I'm afraid of disappointing you, afraid that one day you'll think I should never have brought this woman into my home." Elias leaned his elbows on the table, his eyes deep and gentle in a way Western men rarely showed. "Clara, I don't regret taking you in, and I've never regretted choosing to trust you." There was a long silence, but it wasn't a sad silence. It was like the silence of two fields facing each other after a storm, finally able to breathe together without trembling. Clara opened the wooden box. Inside were discolored letters, each tied with a thin string. Elias saw the masculine handwriting, the smudged ink written in haste. Clara said softly, "I don't keep them to use against anyone. I keep them to remind myself that I'm not crazy, that what he did to me was real, that I wasn't imagining it." Elias nodded slowly. "I understand." "How much do you trust me?" Clara asked softly, a question she hadn't dared ask anyone in years. Elias replied with Western simplicity, "Enough to stand by you when the storm comes." Clara bowed her head. "I've never had anyone say that to me before." Elias closed his eyes for a second. "Maybe it's time you had one." The afternoon gradually fell. The wind weakened. A rare ray of sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a long golden streak on the wooden floor. Clara stood up, walked to the door, and opened it slightly. The cold air rushed in, but she stood there for a long time, looking out at the white world outside her, hands lightly gripping the door frame as if she were weighing a turn. Elias walked up behind her. "What do you think I think?" Clara took a deep breath. "Maybe I've run long enough." Elias didn't touch her. He just stood there close enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Clara whispered, "I don't want to live on the run anymore. I want to stay." Elias asked softly. "With me?" Clara turned to look at him. Her pale blue eyes were filled with emotion. "To someone who didn't see me as a shadow of sin. To someone who gave me a roof in the storm. To someone who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Elias let out a small sigh, a sigh that seemed to relieve some of the loneliness that had accompanied him for years. He nodded. "If you want to stay, I will stand by you." Clara closed her eyes like someone who had just found a place to stand after a long life of drifting. But just as the moment was beginning to warm, Elias heard a very light crunch, the sound of snow being trampled, coming from the entrance to the forest to the east. He turned his head immediately. Clara stiffened. Elias lowered his voice, only whispering, "Someone is coming." Peace dissipates like smoke in the wind. The crunch, sound of the snow being trampled on grew louder and louder. It wasn't the steady pace of an animal's footsteps, but rather the slow, cautious rhythm of a human trying to get closer without making a sound. Elias Turner stood in the doorway, his breath caught in his chest. A cold wind whipped across the porch, lifting the scarf hanging beside it, its edge scraping against the wood. The air was thick, as if frozen just before it exploded. Clara Merrick stood behind Elias, her hands gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white. She knew that sound. She had heard it for months on the run, the footsteps of people who came not to find the truth but to end the story as they wished. Elias lowered his voice just enough for Clara to hear. Go inside. Hide behind the fireplace. Don't come out until I call. Clara shook her head, her voice small but firm. No, I won't leave you alone. Clara. Elias's voice was low, not a command, but the voice of someone who had saved many lives before becoming the lone man of this valley. I need you safe. Clara looked at him for a few seconds, a look filled with the pain of someone who had lost so much but also with newfound faith. She stepped back into the house, standing against the wall near the fireplace, her hands shaking but her eyes never leaving Elias's. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Elias gripped the doorknob and opened it a crack. A cold wind blew against his face, and in the vast whiteness of the snow 3 figures appeared. The 3 men from Missouri. Their horses were tied 10 yards from the house, a sign that they had not come for a light chat. The leader, a man with a bony face and dark eyes, stepped forward. He smiled, half-heartedly, a smile filled with arrogance. Just want to talk, Turner. Elias opened the door a little more, but not enough for them to enter. Then speak. The leader looked over Elias's shoulder into the house. There's no point in talking without the person we're looking for. Elias blocked the crack of the door with his shoulder. She won't come out. The other guy, a younger one, eyes as sharp as box cutters, stepped forward. Do you know who we are? We speak for the Hale family. We have the right to bring her back to Missouri. There is no Montana law that says so, Elias replied without a second's delay. Here the person being sought must have a warrant. You don't have one. The young man curled his lips. We don't need a warrant to work for the Hale family. That sentence made Clara in the house shiver slightly. Elias opened the door a little wider so they could see him clearly, calm but not retreating. I'll be frank, he said, his voice deep. You're not taking her anywhere. The leader took a deep breath, then shrugged. I'm sorry. I was hoping to speak more politely, but you don't seem to be cooperating. He gave a signal with his eyes. The other 2 men moved their feet to either side, a clear encirclement tactic. Elias understood. He lowered his hand to his belt where his pistol hung in its holster at his side. He didn't need to draw it, just placing his hand there was enough for the other 3 to see. The atmosphere was tense. One guy said, Mr. Turner, are you trying to pick a fight with the Hale family? Elias kept his eyes on him. The Hales aren't here. I just saw 3 strangers standing in front of my house. The young man laughed bitterly. You talk tough. But are you sure it's worth protecting her? Elias replied. I decide that myself. It is not your place to teach. At that moment, a large flake of snow fell from the roof, making a plop sound. Clara, startled reflexively, took half a step towards the door, and the leader saw her silhouette, if only for a moment. His eyes lit up like someone who had spotted his prey after months of hunting. Huh. She really is in there. He took another step toward the porch. Elias immediately stood, completely blocking the entrance. Stop. The leader narrowed his eyes. What are you going to do? Shoot me? Elias didn't answer. He made no threats, no show of gun. He just stood there, steady as an old pine tree. His presence alone said he was ready for anything. The wind swirled through the yard, whipping the snow beneath their feet. The leader stared at Elias, then lowered his voice as cold as steel. You're blocking our way, which means you're on her side. Elias replied softly, but each word seemed to be hammered into wood. I stand for what is right. The young man sneered. The right thing. She killed Reverend Jonathan Hale. At that moment, Clara could no longer remain silent. She pushed the door open and stepped out to stand behind Elias, even as he turned to signal her to step back. The wind whipped at her face, but Clara held her head high. I didn't kill him out of malice. He wanted to take my life. I defended myself. Her voice was not high, but clear and solid as a rock. The 3 men looked at each other, surprised that she dared to go out. The bony-faced man slowly replied, You'll have that in court. In Missouri. Clara shook her head. No. Your court is where the Hale family's power obscures all light. The young man took another step forward. Do you think hiding in this tiny farm will change anything? Clara replied without hesitation. I think. At least there are people here who don't consider me a sinner. The leader looked at Elias half mockingly, half threateningly. Turner, she has you in her crosshairs. Elias didn't leave Clara to deal with it alone. He took a half step forward, completely removing her from their attack range. You leave my land, Elias said, his voice as deep as thunder echoing off the cliffs. No warrant, no authority here. Let Sheriff Graves handle it. If you take one more step, you're trespassing on my property. The bony-faced man clenched his jaw. The wind picked up in a strong gust. Snow flew in blinding gusts, whipping at their clothes and tangling in their hair. No one moved. There was a long silence, the kind that made the forest seem to hold its breath. Then the leader blew white steam and said, "Okay, we're leaving today." But he added immediately afterward, his voice low as a knife through the crack of the door, "But we'll be back. And next time, we won't be here to talk." He pulled on the reins and turned his horse. The other two followed. The heavy sound of horse hooves mixed with the wind. Only when the three figures disappeared behind the pines did Clara breathe heavily, a breath as shaky as someone who had just run through battle. Elias turned back, placing his hand on her shoulder. "I told you to stay inside." Clara looked at him, her eyes sparkling but strong. "I have hidden long enough." Elias was silent for a moment, then said, "They will come back. I am sure of it." "And I won't run anymore," Clara replied, her voice strangely calm. Elias looked at her for a long time. There was something about the way Clara stood in the snow, fragile yet unyielding, that made his chest swell with a feeling he thought he could no longer feel. A light wind blew, carrying the smell of pine of snow and a warning that it was not over. But in the midst of that desolation, Elias knew one thing: when the three men returned, they would no longer face a lone woman. They will face two people stronger together. That evening the snow stopped falling, but the air was as heavy as before the storm. The sky was leaden, gray, starless, moonless. Occasionally the wind blew through the pines, making a curving sound like the sigh of the mountains. The Coppertrail Valley was silent, but inside the cabin they both knew the silence was the most dangerous kind of silence. Elias Turner sat by the fire, his hands clasped together. He was still wearing his thick coat, as if his body had not yet adjusted to the warmth of the afternoon's confrontation. His face was more tense than usual. His deep eyes were calm, but it was a strained calm, the calm of someone who has to hold many thoughts at once. Clara Merrick stood at the window, gently pushing aside the woolen curtain. She looked out into the darkness where the shadows of the forest were a sheer wall. The shadows of the trees moved as the wind blew, making them look like figures lurking in the darkness. Clara knew it was just an illusion of her stressed mind, but she still couldn't take her eyes off. Elias looked at her. "Clara, you should sit down and rest." She pulled down the blinds and turned around, still clutching the woolen scarf around her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their eyes." Elias nodded slightly. "I understand." Clara sat down in a chair at the table. She placed the wooden box in front of her, her hand instinctively touching the lid, as if it were the only talisman left in the world. There was a long silence. Only the soft crackling of the fire could be heard. Clara spoke first, her voice low but clear. "I thought by running away from Missouri I would be free of them forever. But I guess I was wrong. I got you into unnecessary trouble." Elias leaned back in his chair, his shoulders relaxing. "If that trouble brought you here, then I don't see why it was in vain." Clara looked up at him, her eyes a mixture of surprise and disbelief. Elias continued, his voice as deep as old wood. "I am not used to taking people into my home. But you bring this place back to life." Clara bowed her head as if his words made her heart heavy with emotion. "Elias," she said softly, "I don't think I deserve to have someone say such things to me." He smiled slightly, a rare, fleeting smile, but warm enough. "Has anyone ever told you that worthiness is up to you to decide?" Clara clenched her fists. After a while, Clara stood up and walked to the fireplace. She slowly added 2 more logs, then sat down on the floor beside it, closer to the warmth. The firelight fell on her face, highlighting the slight curve of her jaw, the mark of many sleepless nights, many years of suppressed crying. Elias saw it, and it hurt him in a way he didn't expect. "I have a confession to make," Clara said, looking into the fire as if about to confess a mortal sin. "When I came to Coppertrail, I trusted no one. I trusted no men, I trusted no law, I trusted no myself." Elias sat silently, not daring to interject. "But this afternoon," Clara continued, her voice trembling slightly, "when you stood at the door blocking me, I realized something that scared me more than those 3 men." Elias leaned over a little. Clara took a deep breath and said slowly, "I'm afraid. I'm starting to need you." The room suddenly became crowded. Not because of danger, but because the statement was too true, too heavy, too many years since she had dared admit the same thing to anyone. Elias didn't react immediately. He looked at Clara for a long time, not shocked, not confused, just really listening. Finally, he said, "Clara, needing someone is not a shameful thing." Clara shook her head. "But it makes me weak." Elias stood up and walked to the fireplace. He sat down beside her, far enough away that she wouldn't feel constrained, but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Not weak," he said, "but alive." Clara turned to look at him. The firelight reflected in her eyes. Elias continued more slowly, more quietly. "I lost my wife and children on their way home. They were caught in an avalanche in the mountains. That day, I thought if I hadn't let them go, if I had told them to stay home just one more day." He swallowed. "For 3 years I believed I was not allowed to need anyone. I thought I had to live like a shadow." Clara didn't blink. "But then you came," Elias said, "and I realized living without someone to remember, to care for, to protect, is weak." The words hit Clara like an arrow in a place she had always hidden. For a long moment the two of them just looked at each other. Neither of them dodged, nor did they hide. The silence between them was no longer as cold as the night, but as warm as the first sound of a zither after many years of silence. A strong wind blew through the roof, making the window frame rattle. Clara, startled, turned back to the window, her heart pounding. Elias put his hand on her shoulder, his voice slow and steady. "They will come back, but not tonight. Not in this cold." Clara nodded, but she still kept her eyes on the darkness outside. Elias understood. When one has lived so long in fear, sometimes peace becomes an enemy, because it makes one more wary than in the face of danger. After a while, Elias said, "Go to sleep. I will be on watch tonight." Clara turned her head. "No, let me stay up with you." "Clara." Elias looked at her. His eyes seemed to say he didn't want her to get more tired. But Clara replied with a strong, gentle look, but with a hidden fire inside, "I don't want to leave you alone. Not after today." Elias stopped pressing. "Okay." They moved their chairs closer to the fireplace. Clara pulled up a woolen blanket. Elias placed the teapot on the metal bar above the fire to keep it warm. They sat side by side in a comfortable silence, like companions who had just traveled a difficult stretch of road. Occasionally, Elias heard Clara sigh softly. Occasionally, Clara heard Elias toss and turn as if he were deep in thought. No one slept, but both were less lonely. As the night grew late, Clara asked in a low voice, "Elias, if they come back tomorrow, will you regret protecting me?" He looked at her longer than usual. "Clara, you may not see how strong you are, but I do, and I want you to know something." He placed his hand on his chest. "Protecting you isn't what I regret. What I fear is not protecting you in time." Clara paused. Then she bowed her head as if to keep her heart from bursting with emotion. It was the moment they realized they had gone too far from their initial strangeness, and too close to something they were both afraid to admit, that they were no longer just roommates. They became each other's support. As dawn broke, the sky changed hues. The deep blue of night faded, revealing the first light of day. A thin veil-like light spread over the distant mountains. The pines on the hillside shimmered in the mist, frozen by the chill of the night before. Smoke rose gently from Elias Turner's chimney, mingling with the still chill air. Elias did not sleep. Neither did Clara. They still sat side by the fire, each with slightly dark circles under his eyes. But there was something new in that weariness, something like a quiet reassurance. They both knew that though the night had been long and heavy, they had made it through together. Clara rose first. She pulled the woolen blanket from her shoulders, folded it, and placed it on a chair. "Elias," she said, her voice hoarse from sleep, "I want to step outside for a moment." Elias raised an eyebrow. "It's cold." "Are you sure?" Clara nodded. "I need to breathe. I need to see if I'm really standing." He understood. Anyone who has been on the run for so long always checks the ground beneath their feet, even if it is only the familiar ground of home. Elias threw his long cloak over his shoulders, then reached for Clara's thick coat. "When you go out, wear this. The wind is still strong." He handed her his coat. Clara took it and put it on her hands, trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from being cared for in a way she had long forgotten. They walked to the door together. When Elias opened it, pale light flooded in, accompanied by a breeze so strong with the scent of the mountains that Clara sucked in her breath. The world outside was vast and white, but not as scary as before. Clara stood on the porch for a long time, looking down at the footprints Elias had cleared with a shovel yesterday. Where the three men had left their tracks, there was now only a flat layer of snow, as if no one had ever trodden it. But in her mind, the footprints were still there, deep as a scar on her heart. Even though it's covered by snow, Clara said slowly. You still remember where it is, don't you? Elias asked. Clara nodded. I remember, and I guess that's what makes me tired. I thought once I left Missouri it would all go away, but those footsteps buried in the snow are still in my head. Elias did not interrupt. He let Clara speak, because sometimes speaking is the only way to ease one's mind. Clara turned to look down the valley. The low sun was setting, casting the distant hills in a rare golden hue of the winter west. It was so beautiful that Clara felt her chest tighten. I've been running too long, Elias. He nodded slightly. I know. I thought I was running because I wanted to live, Clara continued. But the more I ran, the more I felt like I was just existing, not really living. Elias was silent for a moment. Then he said, his voice deep and sympathetic. Existing to survive is different from living to be at peace. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, and I want to live again. Elias was not surprised. He only asked one question, and what do you think is the path to resurrection? Clara opened her eyes. She turned to look at him, her gaze very steady. It is a road that no longer runs. Elias tried to keep his breathing steady. That means, Clara said, speaking as if to herself, I'll write a report to Sheriff Graves myself. I'll tell the whole story. I'll let Montana law decide the truth, not Hale law. Elias did not interrupt. Clara continued, I don't want to live in fear. I can't have those three guys hanging around waiting to catch me on the street. I don't want my heart to drop out of my chest every time I hear a knock on the door. The new day slowly shone over the roof, reflecting into Clara's determined eyes. I will face it. I will let them hear the truth from my mouth. Elias was silent, not because he disagreed, but because he realized this moment was more than a legal decision. It was the moment Clara was reborn. He lowered his voice. Are you sure? Once you start that journey, there is no turning back. Clara looked at him for a long time. She had never looked at anyone like that in her life, the eyes of someone who had just decided to free himself. I've been backing away for years, Clara said. I want to step forward for once. Properly. Elias felt a surge of courage inside her. A fragile courage stronger than any fear. A courage only possessed by those who had stood between life and death many times. He took a step closer to her. If you want to go, I will go with you. Clara blinked. Elias, not to make the decision for you, he said, but so you don't have to go alone. A gentle breeze blew by, swirling a few snowflakes onto the porch. Clara leaned forward towards Elias, wiping away the tears that had just spilled over. Thank you, she said softly. Not thanks for helping, but thanks for being there when she thought she couldn't get up anymore. Inside the house, while Elias prepared their coats and small snacks for their afternoon trip to town, Clara stood before a small mirror. She looked at herself in the dim light. Her face was gaunt, but there was a light in her dark blue eyes that she had not seen in a long time. She said to the mirror, as if to the woman she had forgotten, I will not hide anymore. A light tap sounded behind him. Elias. Clara. We'll go when the sun's a little higher. It's still cold, but the road to town is passable. Clara turned back, smiling slightly, the first smile in weeks that had any real meaning. I'm ready. Elias looked at her for a few seconds, then said, I'm proud of you. That made Clara turn away to hold back the tears. Not tears of pain. Tears of healing. When they stepped outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. The light was weak but clear. Enough for them to see the long, white road ahead. Enough for Clara to understand. This was the day she chose to stop letting the past pull her back by her hair. This was the day she stepped out of the darkness on her own 2 feet. Elias stood in front of the wooden gate, holding his hand to his eyes to block the sun. Clara, wrapped in a scarf, stood beside him. Clara, he asked, are you sure you are strong enough? She smiled, peaceful, strong light as the breath of dawn. I've been strong for a long time. I just forgot. Elias nodded. A small smile played around the corner of his lips, the smile of one witnessing a spirit rise. And so they took to the streets. No running, no hiding, no avoiding. For the first time in years, Clara Merrick is moving toward life, not away from fear. That afternoon, as the sun rose high over the western mountains, Elias Turner and Clara Merrick rode down to Coppertrail. The road was long and winding among snow-covered pines, but Clara no longer shivered as before. Her back was straight. Her hands held the reins firmly, but not too tightly. She was no longer a fugitive. Elias walked beside her, watching Clara with a quiet but proud gaze. The wind blew through his coat, carrying with it the scent of earth pine and a day that would change everything. As they approached Coppertrail, the sounds of chatter, the sound of hooves, and the creaking of windmills began to be heard. A few townspeople watched them from a distance. News of the three strange men who had come to town yesterday seemed to have spread. Everyone was curious, but no one dared to speak up. Sheriff Matthew Graves stood waiting in front of his office, his wide-brimmed hat obscuring much of his face, but his eyes were as bright and sharp as ever. He was a veteran of law enforcement, calm as a mountain and rarely in a hurry. As Elias and Clara stopped their horses, "Mr. Graves descended the 2 wooden steps, his voice booming. "Turner, Merrick, I imagine you two have something to say." Clara tightened her grip on the reins. She took a deep breath. "Yes, Sheriff. I've come to report everything." Elias helped Clara down from the horse. His movements were gentle, but they carried a certain firmness that was characteristic of him, as if just standing next to him relieved one of half of one's fear. Clara approached the police chief, her hands clasped together, the strange calm of someone who had made the most important decision of her life. Sheriff Graves nodded. "Come in. We'll talk inside." The Coppertrail Sheriff's office was small, warm, and smelled of old paper. Its windows faced the main road, where people occasionally stopped to peek in. They weren't curious out of malice. They were curious the way Westerners are curious, because big things rarely happen here. Clara sat down on the wooden chair in front of Graves. Elias stood behind her, close enough so that Clara didn't feel alone, but far enough away that she could tell her own story. Graves said slowly, "Before you begin, I want you to know my mission is to find the truth, not to find someone to blame." Clara nodded, her shoulders relaxing a little, and she told, "No omissions, no avoidance, no trembling." She told him about the Reverend Jonathan Hale, about the evenings when he would shut the door, reading the Bible in a voice that faded into threats, about the first beating, about the control that followed, about the drunken letter he wrote, the one that exposed him as his true self and which Clara would later keep as her only proof, about that fateful night when he lunged for the knife and she grabbed the iron candle. Sheriff Graves did not interrupt. He wrote slowly, occasionally looking up to ask for details, then went back to writing. His eyes were serious, fair, and had the understanding of someone who had seen too much of the West, where women often stood alone in the storm. When Clara finished, Graves pushed the papers aside and sighed. "You're not lying," he said. "I see it as clearly as the sun outside." Clara bit her lip. "But Missouri law, this is Montana," Graves interrupted. "And in Montana, self-defense is not a crime." A tear Clara tried to hide slipped from the corner of her eye. Elias placed his hand on her shoulder, as light as the wind touching the field. Sheriff Graves stood up. "Those 3 men are still near Coppertrail. They came to the tavern this morning to cause trouble. I detained them to avoid trouble. And now," he glanced at Clara, "I have every reason to have them run out of town." Clara looked up, her eyes shining relief and surprise in the same look. "But," Graves lowered his voice more seriously, "you have to decide. Do you want them deported from Montana, or do you want them sent back to Missouri knowing no one is here to help them? It's up to you." Elias looked at Clara. Graves looked at Clara, and Clara, for the first time in years, looked at herself through choice. "I want them out of Montana," she said slowly and firmly. "I don't want any more hatred. I just want to live like a normal human being." The sheriff smiled slightly, a rare smile. "A brave choice." That afternoon, as Clara and Elias stood at the edge of town, they watched 3 men being led away from Coppertrail. Snow swirled through the horses' hooves. The 3 men shot Clara venomous looks, but Graves's shout forced them to turn away. No more chasing. No more stalking. No more nights when Clara would have to listen to imaginary footsteps. Elias touched her elbow lightly. "It's over." Clara did not answer at once. She watched them until they were completely lost behind the pines. And when the wind blew, a long gust sweeping away the footprints in the snow, Clara said softly, "I am free." Elias nodded slightly. "Yes, And not because I helped, but because you found yourself. Clara turned to look at him, her gaze brighter than the midwinter sun. Elias. I want to stay in Coppertrail. Not because I'm afraid to go back to Missouri, but because this is where I can live, and where there are people who make me believe in life again. Elias's heart gave a slight beat. Not enough to make him dizzy, but enough to make him take a deep breath. He placed his hand on hers, his hand rough but gentle to the touch. If you want to stay, this is your home. Clara smiled. A pure smile. Without fear. Without shame. Just what she had been waiting for all these years. Peaceful. As they returned to the Coppertrail Valley, the sunset stretched slowly through the pines, covering the ground in a warm orange glow like a quiet heartbeat. Clara dismounted and stood before the cabin. I never thought I would have a place to return to, she whispered. Elias stood beside her. Now you have it. Clara turned her eyes soft and deep. Thank you, Elias, for not abandoning me, for believing in me, for standing in front of my door and blocking out the world outside. Elias slowly placed his hand on hers. Thank you, for coming out of the darkness to find your own light. Clara looked at him, then said softly, Let's move on. Together. Elias smiled, a rare, real smile, as if he had just shed the burden of many years. Together. In that moment the wind blew across the fields, carrying the scent of pine, the scent of snow, the scent of new life. And under the vast sky of the west, two people who had been wounded by so many wounds finally found what they thought was lost forever: faith, freedom, and a chance to love again. The story of Elias and Clara reminds us that no one has gone too far to find the light again. No matter how much loss there is in life, no matter how broken a heart is to the point of wanting to close all the doors, a moment of courage, however small, can open the way to resurrection. Pain makes people shrink, but the truth is only when we dare to face it can we step out of the darkness. Silence is sometimes strength, because in that silence people find themselves again, know where they want to go, what they want to keep, and what they want to let go. For those over 60 who have experienced broken relationships, separations, or simply long years of emptiness, this story offers a gentle reminder. It's never too late to choose peace, to trust again, and to be loved again. Thank you for taking the time to follow the story. If you feel moved, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to bring healing and humane stories. Wishing you peace.